Welcome to SQL Projects for Everyone in VS Code. I'm Drew Skwiers-Koballa, and this is SQL Conference 2025. In this session, we're going to focus on getting to know SQL database projects in VS Code. So SQL database projects are this human-readable format for a database definition. And while they provide a bunch of local development environment capabilities, their true advantage starts to shine through when you start integrating with CI/CD. However, you definitely need that base of understanding how to edit and develop with them locally, so that's why we're going to focus on VS Code for the next 30 minutes. We're going to use a series of demos. We're going to spend a lot of time in VS Code to see how to use SQL projects in different ways so that you can fit SQL projects with your development process as well as your level of database experience. I am the product manager for SQL projects and the SQL package CLI and DACFX .NET library for SQL DevOps. You can find me on LinkedIn and GitHub, but I spend a lot of time focusing on different ways that developers can create, modify, and iterate on their database objects. As I mentioned, we're going to spend a bunch of time in VS Code today. I am going to do a brief introduction on what SQL projects are, as well as we wrap up, touch on what is not quite yet in VS Code as far as SQL projects capabilities. When you think about SQL projects, you might already have a familiarity with them. You might already have some misconceptions, and that's completely okay because they're actually a pretty big beast of a bunch of different capabilities. But if we step back and think about why we might want to use SQL projects, that helps us understand them a little bit better. The first part about SQL projects that you might be considering is whether or not you're trying to track your database in source control. So how do you know what the state of your database is? How can you tell if someone changed something and when it was changed? Having your database in source control is oftentimes kind of this minimum bar where people are like, this is where SQL projects become really useful. Another place where SQL projects fit really nicely is when you're trying to quickly create development and test instances. SQL projects are really strong for creating development environments where you just need a copy of the objects themselves. You're not looking to do full database restores, or if you are doing a restore, you also need to apply certain changes based on that set of data. And so this is where SQL projects do a really nice job of allowing us to deploy databases or deploy changes really quickly. Speaking of database deployments with SQL projects, the tooling around SQL projects, there's a couple different ways where you kind of have this button. It's like a big red easy button for publishing or deploying changes. This is nice, but it does have some pitfalls because you want to understand the changes that are being applied. And so this is another big advantage of SQL projects where while you can hit a publish button or have an automated publish pipeline, you can also generate the change scripts themselves so you can review them. There's kind of a bunch of different ways to use SQL projects and turn them upside down and let them fit your workflow. This does also include if you're using an ORM like EF Core. Sometimes people kind of understand that their ORM is helping them out by doing the early database object definitions, as well as already has facilities to apply database migrations. You can layer SQL projects on top of that, so you can get a better understanding of what the database object definitions are as more of a declarative thing that you can review in source control, as well as if you are generating database change scripts, these are something that DBAs and other people responsible for how the database functions over time can be a little bit more comfortable with applying. If we step further into what's happening with the SQL project, I have this kind of prototypical example that steps us through the different life cycle stages. The SQL project itself, like I mentioned, is the definition for a SQL database. You have a bunch of different scripts that define an object each. So a SQL project may be really large. There could be thousands, tens of thousands of files that each define an object in the database. The SQL project example that we're using at the moment has a customer table in it amongst all of the other objects. And so that customer.sql file has the create table statement stored in it. As you are developing and working on these files, you would do a build. Now, as a .NET build, you don't need to be doing .NET development for the rest of your development. You don't even need to be an application developer to use SQL projects, but the library that we build them on top of is a .NET library, so you have to have the .NET SDK. That's all well and good because it gives you a lot of functionality. Because we're running a build process, it is taking a look at all of the objects in that SQL project, validating the T-SQL syntax is correct, and validating that the object references to each other are correct. So if I have a foreign key, I can't just reference something that doesn't exist. The build is going to throw an error and fail, so I understand that I'm trying to put something together that really is not going to work. So this is kind of helping put guardrails on our development. When the build succeeds, we get a build artifact, a DACPAC, D-A-C-P-A-C, DACPAC. The DACPAC model file, it's really just a zip file with a bunch of XML in it, but it is the database definition. So it has taken all of these different references and what columns belong to which tables and which stored procedures reference different things and put them all together in this artifact that the rest of the tooling can understand. This is particularly important because around SQL projects, while we're going to focus on VS Code today, there is a bunch of different tooling, including the SQL package CLI. This is definitely one that we rely on quite a bit because it allows us to take our processes into CI/CD environments. Whenever you're doing a publish from VS Code or within SQL package, that deploy process, that publish command, is going to take a look at the DACPAC and the database definition in there, as well as the database and what its definition is, and figure out what the difference is. This is kind of your schema compare. This is running behind the scenes to figure out what is the difference. Then SQL package puts together a deployment plan of what steps need to happen to make this look like this. In the case of our example that we have going on right now, the DACPAC contains a customer table with 3 columns in it: first name, last name, and region. We didn't know this, but evidently the customer table already exists on the database and the first name and last name columns already are there. So the region column is really what is new. We had no idea. We were not keeping track of this. We don't know all of our different environments. I personally do not have every database memorized. However, that's okay. That's what the tooling is here to help us with. So when SQL package figure out the deployment plan, it was, oh, I need to have a step where the table is altered and the column is added, and it generates the T-SQL syntax to make that happen. Depending on what you're running, whether it's a publish where it immediately applies this, or if you're generating that deployment script where it's going to give you this command to run in your own time, then you're going to get that output. But this is the process. This is the development process that gets created around SQL projects. Now, I like this graphic because it summarizes kind of the prototypical development process, but I don't love this graphic because the arrows are all headed in one direction. They're headed to the right, where you build your SQL project and publish it to a database. If you're hanging with me for the rest of the 30 minutes, you're going to see that this is not the only direction that we can take our changes. The tooling around SQL projects allows us to take a database definition back into a DACPAC or back into a SQL project even. So again, even if you're using an ORM or you're doing your development against a live database and then you want to work with a SQL project, that's totally fine. Those processes will all work with SQL projects. So before we go any further, let's start diving right into VS Code and getting our development environment set up. Starting from VS Code and making sure we've got it set up all right, we can double check our extensions. If you've installed the SQL extension, this is the one that brings you the Object Explorer and the ability to run queries. It brings by default as well the SQL Database Projects extension. The SQL Database Projects extension gives you the projects view, which is really helpful for all of its extra functionality around SQL projects. From the command line, we can set up a few more things. So we'll need the SQL projects templates if we want to have an easier time creating new projects, but this is not a requirement. So I'll do a .NET new install Microsoft build SQL templates. This means I can create a new SQL project as well as new code analysis rules a little bit more easily. I definitely want to install SQL package, so I'll do the .NET tool install for Microsoft.SQL package. This is a really easy way to install SQL package cross-platform, and it'll be the same everywhere, and then it's immediately available on your path at SQL package. I already have a container deployed locally with the database that we're going to start our development from. So even though I don't have any database projects yet, I can create one really quickly from an existing database by using that menu option, selecting the existing connection, and I'm going to call this the Core AdventureWorks project. These objects we're going to assume are created by another team or maybe a third-party vendor, and we're developing on top of them and beyond them. We're not working in a bubble here. So we've created this as our Core AdventureWorks project, and we can manage those objects from that specific project. And from the database projects vein, we've got a nice context menu that gives us the ability to build and publish quickly. So if I select build, unsurprisingly, our T-SQL syntax and all the references will be valid, and our build succeeds. So as we look at doing more forward development, we can develop objects in addition to the ones that were provided in the core of AdventureWorks by adding another project that we'll call Shipping AdventureWorks. Today, as we work through our example, we're representing a team of developers that are creating functionality for the warehouse or shipping group at AdventureWorks, especially around adding images for products so we make sure we're picking the right things off the shelf. Let's go ahead and create our Shipping AdventureWorks secondary SQL project. We'll do this with the .NET new templates from the command line. So if we do .NET new SQL project -n for the name Shipping AdventureWorks, this is creating a blank SQL project, unlike the first time we created a SQL project where it added all those objects from the sales LT and DBO schemas. Now we have that empty SQL project with no SQL files in our folder. Now, the one thing we haven't set is the target platform. When we created Core AdventureWorks, it was from a database, so it came in by default as SQL 2022. The target platform is an important setting for the SQL project because it allows us to define what set of T-SQL syntax is valid to be used. This also opens up SQL projects as a nice way to test what different platforms your SQL development is compatible with. So if you're curious if your database is compatible with Azure SQL Database, you can use that SQL project, change the target platform, and try out your build, and it'll let you know if you used any syntax that wasn't compatible. Now, both projects defaulted to SQL 2022, so we're ready to keep developing since that's my local container environment. We could add new items to Shipping AdventureWorks through the context menu here that has all those templates. But I'm going to hop back over to the File Explorer because I can do things there as well. Same in either direction. I'm going to start creating my utils schema. This is where I'm going to keep some store procedures that I use as helpful from time to time, and I'll create my utils schema file. So I've started adding objects to Shipping AdventureWorks, but I don't need to copy everything from the Core AdventureWorks project into Shipping AdventureWorks. I can make these two projects related to each other. So all of these sales LT and DBO objects can become part of Shipping AdventureWorks through a concept of database references. Now, the Shipping AdventureWorks project can become related through database references seen there in the database projects pane. So if I add a database reference, I can select from the different kinds of database references, project, DACPack, and a package or a new package. We'll start with project. So we're just going to reference directly to the core AdventureWorks project, and we're going to do same database. We're not going to do different database. We're not going to do different server. We're going to start with the same database because we want it to become all part of the same database when we eventually go to publish it. So stepping out of vscode for just a second. So we can have project relationships either to other projects, to a DACPack, so that compiled artifact, as well as to a package reference or a packed up DACPack. We set up the SQL project database reference, and we can try out the other types as well, but there are different ways that we can relate our project to another one. If I start creating with multiple objects, I do need to be mindful of how this impacts the performance of my build. We're working with really small projects here, and the core AdventureWorks builds and then shipping AdventureWorks builds because I have the database reference to that project. So the combined time there is 1.8 seconds and 1.2 seconds. Let's go back a little bit and we'll comment out our project reference. So we no longer have the relationship to those objects. We do still want those objects, so we'll try a different database reference type. Instead of doing a project reference, let's take a look. We've got the DAC pack from the core AdventureWorks build. If this is being developed more slowly, we don't need to be building it as often. It's not going to change unless those objects are changed. Let's add a database reference to the DAC pack itself. It's still the same database reference. We're not looking to have three-part naming or anything. And we'll locate that DAC pack in core AdventureWorks bin and debug. We are going to let the errors come through if we have unresolved references. We like those guardrails. And now we have the artifact reference to the DAC pack. We're now responsible for copying the DAC pack around to all of our build environments, so that includes into source control. But the benefit can be significant because the build time is now reduced based on not needing to build a core AdventureWorks project in addition to shipping AdventureWorks. For larger projects where your build time is 5 minutes, this is a bit of benefit to know about. Let's keep developing on our shipping database. I want to add a stored procedure in our util schema for getting the active connections. This is going to be a stored procedure that calls into a DMV, lists sys exec connections, and pulls some columns out of it so I can get that information. Turns out that DMV is actually not in the user database, it's in the master database. So when I run our build here, we're going to get some warnings that the reference that we're trying to find we can't resolve yet. That's too bad. We don't like getting warnings when we're building SQL projects. We want to make sure that we are truly referencing things correctly. So what about those package references? We've published all of the system databases to NuGet.org, so you can add package references to any of the system databases to really easily ensure that you can resolve relationships to columns and things like those system DMVs. So now in our shipping AdventureWorks, we can see that database reference for master, and if I run .NET Build now, it's going to resolve both our DAC pack reference as well as the package reference to master, and our build succeeds without any warnings because all the columns in that stored procedure were able to be fully validated. Now, creating a package of your own can be done by running .NET Pack. We've just run .NET Pack on the core AdventureWorks project to get a NuGet package. If I were to publish this to a package feed, I wouldn't need to be moving that DAC pack around for the artifact reference all the time, and this would really allow me that efficiency of not needing to copy it into all of our CI pipelines. That'll be a nice benefit for the future. Let's go ahead and publish our SQL project to a dev database just to make sure that we're headed in the right track and we've got everything correct with our SQL project references. So on the SQL projects extension, I can use that context menu and select the publish option here if I'm looking to do a kind of development level deployment. The existing SQL server, the container that I have, is the one that I'm going to use. And I will create a new database that I'll call dev-a, just for creating a totally new database at this point. I'm going to go ahead and do the publish because I am looking to create a fully new development environment. I'm not looking to examine the changes before I make them. I did save a publish profile in case I need to do it later. This would be how I would use more advanced publish settings if I need to access them. The publish kind of goes off real quick, and now I've got the container with the extra database dev A that I made. We can see all of the objects from our core project were included in this publish, so they were part of the deployment because the include composite objects publish option was set to true by default in the SQL database projects extension. If I continue developing our shipping solution, I'm going to add a warehouse schema where I'll be able to keep some of our user tables. So if I create schema warehouse, that'll set us up. And then I can go ahead and add a table for the product photos. Now, one of the nice things about working in VS Code is that GitHub Copilot can help me out. So if I give it that comment, Copilot or whatever assistive AI you use is going to give you a hint on this is what it thinks you should have for your object definition. With the SQL project, it has the visibility to the different objects in your folder, so it can kind of increase its chances of being correct. But you are still responsible for writing good code. And when I run .NET build this time, I'm starting to get errors because I have an unresolved reference. The product table is not in the warehouse schema, it's in the sales LT schema, so I've got to correct that out. But once my build succeeds, I still have an error because I have some case differences in the column names. So as I start sorting all those out and taking my time as a developer to try to bring better quality to my development environment, I'm going to have to fight with the warnings a little bit to make sure I get them all. But this is part of your responsibility. As much as AI can help us, it's not going to be able to do everything for us just yet. However, there is another way that SQL projects can help us by turning on code analysis. Now, I've set this in the Shipping AdventureWorks SQL project, so it's only going to analyze the objects in there. So run irun.net build, it still succeeds. But if I start adding additional objects, like a stored procedure for add product image, where I will have the insert to the table done, and then I select identity to get that value back. When I run build, all of a sudden I'm getting warnings from code analysis. Now I have another case error that I can sort out, but I also have the misuse of identity. I really should be using scope identity here. And so if I clean this up, using the code analysis as a tool to ensure that I'm doing a little bit better development, I'll be able to get my build to succeed again without warnings. So working in VS Code, it's great that you got Copilot there to help you. It can definitely make creating objects faster, but at the same time, you also want to leverage things like code analysis to help you kind of clean up the development as it goes along before it gets shipped out to the database, and then you've got things to clean up down the road due to performance and other issues. Now we have a new table for our development project. And when we deploy this, we're going to sometimes want to have data inserted into this table just as kind of development sample data. We'll use a post-deployment script. So this isn't something that becomes part of the model proper, but it does get run with it, and it'll run every single time after a publish is done. So if I add an insert statement to this post-deployment script, this would run every single time I run publish. Now, I don't actually want to insert every publish. I only want to do it sometimes, and that's where SQL CMD variables come in handy. They allow us to decide or change things about the deployment at deployment time. They're variables that live inside the project and in the DAC pack. So if I add a dev setup SQL CMD variable, I can put an if statement in this post-deployment script that looks at the value of the variable. So the variable will get set when we run the deployment. And then if it is set to, we'll use true just to make it a little bit logical. If that is set to true, then the insert statement will be run. But if not, then it's not going to run the insert statement. SQL CMD variables can be used for object defaults and a few other things as well. So they're definitely helpful. If we have an AdventureWorks database here that has just the same as our core project, but it has data in the different tables. So we've got data existing in the product table. We want to go ahead and run our deployment of our warehouse schema with that new table, but we also want the sample data be inserted. Run that post-deployment script. Let's go ahead and do another publish, and the existence of the SQL CMD variable is going to be detected, and VS Code's going to ask us, do we want to set a value to that variable? We'll choose dev setup, and we'll set it to true for this specific publish. As our deployment runs, the deployment plan to add the additional objects is being determined. It's not going to try to recreate all the tables that already exist, but it will create the stored procedure and the warehouse product image table. Now the post-deployment script will also run because we set the SQL CMD variable to true, and with that we will have values in the product image table that was just created, and we can see those rows there. So it's nice to see that our publish completed, as well as we were able to control the behavior of the publish, or what pieces of that post-deployment script ran because of that SQL CMD value. Earlier in this session, I mentioned that SQL projects don't always have to go in one direction. And so while we created a SQL project from a database through the UI earlier, we can also do this with the SQL package command line, and we can extract it to a folder. We'll call the folder SQL package extract. We do this by setting extract target to schema and object type, or basically any value other than DACPack. And all of a sudden now we have a SQL package extract folder with a bunch of SQL files in it. I can turn this into a SQL project using those same SQL project templates we used earlier. So if I do .NET new SQL project and I name it the same as the folder, it's going to create a SQL proj file in that folder, and all of a sudden I have another SQL project. So we can kind of use this to reverse engineer very quickly, and maybe even with like a shell script that we keep in our project. Now, we've noticed that since we extracted from a database that had references to master DACPack, we're getting warnings. And just for the sake of the example, I'm going to go ahead and really quickly remind you how easy it is to add a database reference. We'll even use a system database reference from this dialog, and we can specify that we want to do package references so we don't have to worry about copying DACPacks around. And then we will be able to build our newly automatically generated SQL project without any warnings, all from a few clicks. So while VS Code has a bunch of great functionality for developing with SQL projects, there are some pieces of functionality that are currently only available in Azure Data Studio but are in the works for VS Code. The first of which is the schema compare interface that you can get to from both the SQL Projects extension as well as Object Explorer. What's special about schema compare, especially for database projects, is that you can compare into a SQL project. So I'm comparing from a database to a SQL project, and we're going to see some objects that are present in the database that aren't present in the project, and we could hit that apply button to go ahead and bring those changes into the project and keep the project up to date. This is another way that you can keep a project up to date as you're actively developing in a database. The other important interface that's present in the Azure Data Studio version of SQL projects is the table designer. So for some developers that like this visual interface that allows you to specify your table definition, this is also something that's just not quite yet available in VS Code for SQL projects development. We just took a whirlwind tour of VS Code for SQL projects, and I hope you got the sense that there's a lot of capabilities within VS Code, as well as with that supplemental terminal for CLI capabilities, that you basically can do just about any kind of SQL development you'd like, where you've got a definition of the database that you can keep in source control, as well as then couple with CI/CD to better automate your deployment, as well as keeping code quality up. There's another session involved in this conference on automation for your database development. But in addition to that, there is also a number of resources around SQL projects at aka.ms/SQL projects and samples that are associated with that. I'd also like to give a shout out to the Aspire SQL projects integration that is part of the community toolkit for Aspire. You can learn more about developing with SQL databases on the new Learning Path by Microsoft for Develop Data-Driven Applications. Go give that a try today and learn your new skill badge. Thank you so much for joining. Again, I'm Drew Skwiers-Koballa, and I hope you're able to give SQL projects out a try because they are for everyone.